Rocket artillery of World War II Katyusha and Nebelwerfer, the history of multiple rocket artillery. Before we examine the mechanics and the history of these two systems, there are a number of details about both weapons that rarely appear in the popular accounts, but that are well documented in the historical record. Stalin approved mass production the day before the war began. The decision to begin mass production of the BM-13 Katyusha was taken on 21st June 1941, the day before Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. According to the Presidential Library of Russia, the Central Committee of the Communist Party issued a resolution that day ordering production of M13 rockets and BM-13 launches to begin. The weapon had been demonstrated to Soviet officials, including Stalin, only days earlier. Stalin had green-lighted it just hours before the war began. At the moment Germany crossed the border, there were exactly 40 completed BM-13 launches in existence. The weapon was so secret it was guarded by the NKVD, and every launcher carried a self-destruct charge. The Katyusha was classified at the highest level. According to Wikipedia, a special unit of NKVD secret police troops was raised specifically to operate the first batteries. Every launcher was fitted with an explosive device so that it could be destroyed before falling into German hands. Battery commanders were personally responsible with their lives for the destruction of any vehicle that could not be retrieved. This was not a theoretical requirement. Captain Ivan Flerov's battery, encircled at Vyazma in October 1941, blew up all its vehicles and fought to the last man. Flerov himself did not survive too. The weapon had no officially acknowledged name. Soldiers invented Katyusha from the factory stamp. The BM-13 was known officially only on smoke-generating equipment. The Nebeltruppen, German chemical corps, provided institutional cover for rocket development throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The weapon was officially a smoke projector. In practice, it was designed from the outset to deliver poison gas, and later adapted for high explosive warheads. The misleading name persisted throughout the war. 6. Germany opened a secret rocket test facility in 1931 because the Treaty of Versailles didn't cover rockets. Tracesofwar.com's documentation of German rocket development confirms that in 1931, the German army opened a test facility for rocket technology at Kummersdorf West. This was explicitly because the Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from developing long-range artillery, but made no specific mention of rockets. The first experiments were low budget, including a 73-min rocket for dropping propaganda leaflets, but the legal loophole provided the institutional framework for what would eventually become the Nebelwerfer. Program .07, the Waffen-SS, copied these. They had already committed to spin-stabilized systems and had no spare industrial capacity. According to Wikipedia's article on the 8-cm Raketenvielfachwerfer, the Waffen-SS, which was in competition with the Wehrmacht for resources, used its political influence to bypass the army and produce its own near copy of the BM-8 from 1943 onward. The resulting 8-cm Raketenvielfachwerfer could fire captured Soviet rockets interchangeably with its own ammunition. The Nebelwerfer's smoke trail immediately revealed its position, a fundamental design flaw. When a Nebelwerfer battery fired, It generated a large and distinctive cloud of smoke and dust that immediately pinpointed its location to enemy observers and artillery. Traces of War.com's analysis of German rocket artillery states directly, after launching, a change of position was paramount to avoid being targeted by enemy artillery or aircraft. The U.S. Army's own documentation of the Nebelwerfer 41 at Rock Island Arsenal confirms that the weapon required some distance between the point of launch and the front line, as its resupply needs made it vulnerable to enemy attack. This meant the first strike had to be decisive. A battery of 4 Katyushas in 7 to 10 seconds equaled 72 conventional artillery howitzers. This comparison appears across multiple independent sources and is directly supported by the technical specifications. Wikipedia's Katyusha article states that a battery of 4 BM-13 launchers could fire a salvo in up to 10 seconds that delivered high explosives over a 400,000 square meter impact zone, an effect roughly equivalent to that of 72 conventional artillery howitzers, or 18 batteries. W2Weapons.com's technical account confirms the figure of 4.35 tons of rocket and high explosive delivered in a single battery salvo. The Soviets knew about the Nebelwerfer from the German-Soviet friendship treaty and used it to develop the Katyusha. The Astronautics.com historical account of the Katyusha, drawing on published technical histories, notes the details of the German Nebelwerfer rocket mortar, which began development in 1936, were known to the Soviets due to the technical exchange of information under the Soviet-German Friendship Treaty, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact arrangements. The Soviet authorities ordered their research institute NII-3 to develop the resulting systems, the 82mm BM-8 and the 132mm BM-13, were built on that foundation. To understand why both Germany and the Soviet Union developed multiple rocket launchers as weapons of war, it is necessary to understand what conventional artillery could and could not do, and what it cost to produce it. A conventional artillery howitzer requires precision machined barrels, complex breech mechanisms and elaborate recoil systems. Building one demands heavy industrial equipment and skilled workers. The barrel of a heavy howitzer takes weeks to manufacture and represents a significant fraction of a country's precision metalworking capacity. A rocket launcher requires none of this. The BM-13's Wikipedia article explicitly notes that it was inexpensive and could be manufactured in light industrial installations which did not have the heavy equipment to build conventional artillery gun barrels. This was not a minor advantage. In 1941, the Soviet Union had lost vast quantities of conventional artillery in the initial German advance. Factories east of the Urals were being rebuilt from scratch. What was needed was a weapon that could be produced quickly, cheaply, and at scale. The Nebelwerfer answered a parallel problem for Germany. Traces of War.com's analysis of German rocket artillery confirms that in mid-1942, this attitude had changed drastically, noting that German industry couldn't deliver a sufficient number of artillery pieces, and so rockets were deployed out of necessity to fill the gap. Both sides, in other words, turned to rocket artillery, at least partly because they could not produce conventional artillery fast enough. Interesting facts. The M13 key manufacturing advantage could be built in light industry without heavy precision tooling. German adoption of rockets mid-1942 partly driven by inability to deliver sufficient conventional artillery. From aircraft rockets to ground artillery, the origins of the Katyusha lie not in artillery, but in aviation. In the mid-1930s, the Soviet Research Institute, RNII, the Reactive Scientific Research Institute, had been developing unguided powder rockets for aircraft, the 82mm RS-82 for fighters, and the 132mm RS-132 for bombers. These were weapons designed to be fired from aircraft against other aircraft and against ground targets. In June 1938, the Main Artillery Directorate authorized RNII to develop a ground-launched multiple rocket system using a modified version of the RS-132. The result of the first design attempts was instructive about the engineering challenges involved. A team under NKVD built a 24-rail launcher that fired modified rockets sideways over the bed of a ZIS-5 truck. The launcher proved unstable during firing. The recoil and blast forces were directed perpendicular to the vehicle's center line, and the truck moved unpredictably. V.N. Galkovsky proposed the solution: mount the rails longitudinally so the rockets fire in the direction the vehicle is pointing. In August 1939, the result was designated the BM-13, the M13 rocket. How it worked. The M13 rocket was a straightforward design. The Wikipedia Katyusha article provides the specifications. 80 centimeters long, 13.2 centimeters in diameter, weighing 42 kilograms. It used a solid propellant motor burning a nitrocellulose propellant, smokeless powder, to generate thrust. Unlike the German Nebelwerfer rockets, which used spin stabilization via angled exhaust vents, the M13 was fin stabilized. 4 fixed fins at the tail kept the rocket on course during flight. This made the M13 simpler and cheaper to produce, but somewhat less accurate than spin-stabilized alternatives. The launcher itself, the BM-13-16, with 16 rails, was mounted on the ZIS-6 truck. 2 jacks at the vehicle's rear were lowered before firing to stabilize the platform against the blast. The crew of 6 would traverse the entire vehicle toward the target. The launcher had no independent horizontal traverse, elevate the rails to the appropriate angle, and then retire to a safe distance before initiating the electrical firing sequence. All 16 rockets could be fired in 7 to 10 seconds. The Soviet artillery branch hated it. The Katyusha's path to adoption was not smooth. Despite its dramatic firepower in a single salvo, the Soviet Army's artillery branch was unenthusiastic. The Wikipedia article notes the objection directly. The artillery branch was not fond of the Katyusha because it took up to 50 minutes to load and fire 24 rounds, while a conventional howitzer could fire 95 to 150 rounds in the same time. A weapon that took 50 minutes to reload was, by conventional artillery logic, a poor substitute for one that could sustain continuous fire. Only 40 launchers had been built. By the time Germany invaded in June 1941, the Soviet Army's institutional reluctance had kept production minimal throughout 1940. First combat Orsha, July 14th, 1941. The first experimental battery of BM-13 launchers. 7 vehicles under the command of Captain Ivan Flerov was formed in late June 1941. The battery's soldiers received only 3 training sessions before deployment. The weapon was so secret that civilian engineers from the RNII accompanied the battery to train the crews. On 14th of July 1941, positioned near the village of Gadici, approximately 5 to 6 kilometers from their target, they fired their first combat salvo. The target was the railway junction at Orsha, which had been captured by German forces. According to the Presidential Library of Russia's documented account, 112 rockets were fired in the first salvo, destroying the railway station, trains, ammunition, and a crossing over the Orsha River simultaneously. German after-action reports described it as a firestorm of shells that burned the railway station of Orsha, all troops and military hardware. Metal was melting and soil was burning. These words, as quoted by Russia beyond the headlines from period combat reports, reflect the combination of physical and psychological effect that would characterize the weapon throughout the war. By September 1941, 7 more batteries had been formed and sent to the front. Interesting facts. First, BM-13 salvo, 14th July 1941, Orsha, 112 rockets fired. By 7 batteries formed by the treaty covered German rocket development began, officially at least, in the 1920s, and its institutional framework was shaped entirely by the need to circumvent the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty banned Germany from developing heavy artillery, defining prohibited weapons in terms of gun calibers and barrel lengths. It said nothing about rockets, the German army's Nebelwerfer, the chemical corps, responsible for smoke and chemical. Weapons provided the organizational cover. Traces of war.com's documented history of German rocket artillery. Records that in 1931, the Army opened a test facility at Kummersdorf West, specifically for rocket development. The name Nebelwerfer, smoke thrower, served as cover for the program's true purpose, which from the outset included the delivery of chemical weapons. The 15C Nebelwerfer 41, the primary system. First weapons delivered under the Nebelwerfer designation for actual rocket use were the 15 cm models. The Wikipedia article on the 15 cm Nebelwerfer 41 provides the production timeline. Rocket development reached fruition in the late 1930s, and the first weapon was delivered to troops in 1940 after the Battle of France. It entered formal service in 1941, used initially on the Eastern Front and later in smaller numbers in carriage adapted from the one used by the 3.7 cm PK-36 anti-tank gun, a practical solution that used an existing wheeled carriage design. The 6 tubes were arranged in a circular cluster. Rockets were loaded from the rear and fired electrically, 2 seconds between each tube, in a diagonal sequence, never 2 adjacent tubes simultaneously, to prevent the heat and blast from distorting the launcher structure. All 6 rockets left the tubes within approximately 90 seconds, were produced over the course of the war, making the 15 cm system the backbone of German rocket artillery. Spin stabilization. Do your technical choice with consequences unlike the Soviet M13, which used fin stabilization. Virtually all German rocket designs used spin stabilization. Exhaust gases were expelled through angled ventures, holes set at a slight angle to the rocket's axis, causing the rocket to rotate in flight, similar to a rifled artillery shell. This gave German rockets greater accuracy than the Soviet fin-stabilized alternatives. However, Traces of War.com notes that spin stabilization was deemed too simple and too low-tech in German engineering. Doctrine, meaning the choice was partly driven by professional preference, rather than purely by performance data. One unusual design, Feature of the 15-centimeter Nebelwerfer rocket is documented in the Wikipedia technical article. The rocket motor was positioned at the front of the projectile, with the exhaust ventures approximately 2/3 down the body from the nose. This was deliberately done to optimize the blast effect. The warhead, sitting at the rear, was still above the ground when it detonated, increasing the fragmentation radius. It was a thoughtful and counterintuitive solution. The 21-cm Nebelwerfer 42 and later variants. The 15-cm system was followed by the 21-cm Nebelwerfer 42, which entered service from 1942. MilitaryFactory.com's technical account records that between 1487 and 1587, examples were delivered to the German army. The 21-cm version carried approximately 22.4 pounds of high explosive. Only high explosive rounds were produced for it, and used the same spin-stabilized principle. A 5-tube launcher replaced the 6-tube arrangement. For greater mobility on the Eastern Front, the Germans developed the Panzerwerfer 42, a 10-tube Nebelwerfer system mounted on an armored Opel Maltier half-track. The War Thunder Wiki's documented account notes that only 296 launcher vehicles and 251 ammunition carriers were produced from February 1943 to March 1944, primarily due to resource shortages. Its limited production numbers constrained its operational impact. Interesting facts. 15-cm NBW 41 production, 6,000 launches, 105.5 million rockets. 15-cm rocket, 31.8 kilos, 25 kilos TNT. Ranging 900 meters, 6 tubes fired in 90 seconds. 1,000 NBW, 4 1,487, 1,587, produced from 1942. 5-tube launcher, Panzerwerfer 42 auf T, Maltier 296 launcher plus 251 ammo carrier vehicles. Produced. Both weapons were feared by those who faced them, and both acquired nicknames that reflected the sounds they made rather than their formal designations. These nicknames are documented in multiple primary and secondary sources and tell us something about the psychological experience of artillery that conventional accounts sometimes understate. What the Germans called the Katyusha, German soldiers called the BM-13 the Stalin orgel. Stalin's organ. The name came from the visual appearance of the launch rails, which resembled the pipes of a church organ, and from the multi-tonal roar of 16 rockets leaving the rails within seconds of each other. MilitaryFactory.com's account records that the scream of the rockets led to the nickname. Russia Beyond the Headlines, citing a period report from the Red Army's counter-offensive in 1941, records the account of a captured German corporal. There were many cases of people becoming mad due to the Soviet rocket launcher fire. The psychological effect was amplified by the nature of the barrage itself. A conventional artillery bombardment typically begins with individual Katyusha salvo arrived without warning. The rockets were in the air for only seconds and delivered its full payload simultaneously across a wide area. WWII-weapons.com's technical account describes a single 4-vehicle battery salvo as dropping 4.35 tons of rocket and high explosive into a 10-acre area in a terrifying 7 to 10 second strike. Although not so accurate as conventional artillery, this rocket launcher was much more feared by German soldiers than conventional artillery. What the Allies called the Nebelwerfer Allied soldiers gave the Nebelwerfer its own distinctive nicknames. The Wikipedia article on the 15 Cini Nebelwerfer 41 records that Allied troops in the Sicily campaign called it Screaming Mimi and Moaning Minnie due to its distinctive sound. Encyclopedia Britannica's entry on the Nebelwerfer describes the noise as eerie and confirms both nicknames. The US Army's own documentation at Rock Island Arsenal confirms the weapon was one of the most psychologically destructive weapons on the battlefields of World War II. The sound of the Nebelwerfer in flight was genuinely unusual. The spin stabilization created a distinctive high-pitched howl as the rocket rotated through the air. Unlike the Katyusha's roar of departure, the Nebelwerfer's most terrifying sound came during the rocket's flight, which gave soldiers a brief, agonizing period of awareness that something was coming toward them before impact. The D-Day Overlord. Historical site notes that the Allies managed to recognize the characteristic sound of firing and the deafening whistling of rockets in the air, which plays a psychological role that is not negligible. The weapon was used throughout the war's Western campaigns, North Africa, Italy, and Normandy, and the psychological dimension was a documented feature of its tactical effect, alongside its physical lethality. Interesting facts: Stalin Orgel, Stalin's organ, German nickname for Katyusha, from organ pipe visual resemblance. Screaming Mimi, Moaning Minnie, Allied nicknames for Nebelwerfer, from distinctive howl. Katyusha salvo described as much more feared by German soldiers than conventional artillery. US Army Rock Island Arsenal designation. Nebelwerfer, one of the most psychologically destructive weapons. On firepower, the Katyusha's advantage was not in individual rocket power, but in volume. 16 rockets from a single vehicle in under 10 seconds, multiplied across a regiment of 36 or more vehicles, produced a saturation of an area that the Nebelwerfer's 6-tube battery, firing over 90 seconds, could not match. The Katyusha was a system designed for massed employment on accuracy. The Nebelwerfer's spin-stabilized rockets were more accurate than the Katyusha's fin-stabilized. And 13, this was a genuine advantage for precision engagement tasks, targeting a specific strong point, for instance, but less relevant in the saturation bombardment role, where both systems were most often employed. On mobility, the truck-mounted Katyusha could fire and immediately withdraw to a safe distance, the shoot-and-scoot tactic that is fundamental to multiple rocket launcher doctrine. The towed Nebelwerfer required setup and breakdown time. Both weapons revealed their position through smoke trails on firing. The Katyusha's ability to leave the area faster made this disadvantage less acute. On production, the Soviet Union produced immediately before an infantry or armored assault crossed the line of departure. At the Battle of Stalingrad and at Kursk, Katyusha regiments were deployed in concentrations that generated genuinely enormous volumes of fire. By the final offensive of 1944-1945, estimates cited in historical accounts suggest over 10,000 Katyusha vehicles were in service, a figure that, if accurate, would mean a single simultaneous salvo could theoretically deliver tens of thousands of rockets within seconds. The Nebelwerfer in combat. The Nebelwerfer followed a different operational pattern. The U.S. Army's Rock Island Arsenal documentation notes that the weapon required some distance between the point of launch and the front line because of its smoke trail and slow reload. The Traces of War.com analysis confirms that German Doctrine required the battery to relocate immediately after firing to avoid destruction. The Nebelwerfer's most significant terrain channeled both attack and defense through narrow corridors where the Nebelwerfer's concentrated firepower was particularly effective. The D-Day Overlord historical account notes it was used throughout the Battle of Normandy for both defensive support and counterattacks. From 1943, as German production of conventional artillery came under increasing strain, the Nebelwerfer's role expanded. Traces of War.com explicitly states that in mid-1942, this attitude had changed drastically. The first reason was that German industry couldn't deliver a sufficient number of artillery pieces, and so rockets were deployed out of necessity. Interesting facts. By end of 1941, 8 Guards mortar regiments, 35 independent battalions, 554 launchers, Nebelwerfer role in Normandy, extensively used in defensive positions and counterattacks. German shift to rockets from 1942, explicitly driven by inability to supply conventional artillery. The weapons examined in this episode did not disappear with the Second World War. They established a category of warfare, the Psychic Multiple Rocket Launcher, or MLRS, that has become one of the most widely used forms of artillery in the world. The BM-13 Katyusha remained in Red Army service until 1980, when it was replaced by later models. The most prolific of its successors was the BM-21 Grad, adopted in 1963, whose 40 missile launchers rockets had a range of 5 to 20 kilometers. Various Grad systems have been exported to more than 50 countries, as documented by astronautics.com. MilitaryFactory.com's account of the Katyusha family notes that the weapon saw service in the First Indochina War, Korean and Vietnam Wars, Cambodian-Vietnamese War, Yom Kippur War, South African Border War, Ogaden War, Iran-Iraq War, and numerous subsequent conflicts through the 2020s. The Katyusha name has become generic for any unguided rocket artillery system. The first laser anti-rocket weapon jointly developed by Israel and the United States was specifically designed to intercept Katyusha-type rockets during their short flight as direct technological lineage from the 1938 RNII laboratory. In Moscow to the modern battlefield, the Nebelwerfer's legacy is less direct, but equally significant. The principle of spin-stabilized rocket artillery influenced post-war German developments and fed into NATO standardized systems. The concept of the Fortress, the aircraft that ended one war and defined the next. Thank you for watching.